Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning, everyone. All right, I'd like to kick things off while everyone's getting settled in. My name is Renner Skidmore, and I'll be moderating today's panel on surviving the elements, climate impacts on winter sports, travel, and dining. Today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. It is 11 a.m. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Boulder is on ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. One other thing I would like to mention is that we want to make sure that you get a chance to ask a question. Here's how we'll handle Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for Q&A. We're using a note card system, so if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and one of our producers will come bring you a note card and a pencil. You must write legibly. If you are a student, please note that on the note card so we can prioritize your questions. And I urge everyone to make your questions brief and to the point. Now, I'd like to do a brief introduction of the panelists and my background.
I'm not sure the microphone works really well.
Is this on?
But it's not on.
Check, check.
Check. Check.
But yeah.
But we had another mic.
All right. There we go. All right. I had to press the on button, apparently. You'd think since I'm young, I'd be good with technology, but mainly cell phones. All right. So my background, I'm a sophomore in the Leeds School of Business, emphasizing on information management and analytics, as well as computer science and philosophy as my minors. I spend most of my free time in the mountains skiing as a semi-professional skier, and I'm from Bozeman, Montana. Over the past year, I've had the opportunity to spend 3 months in Argentina and Bolivia, immersing myself in their culture and language, as well as doing a business tour for a week in Paris. Now, I'm going to introduce our panelists, starting to my left with Ted Martins, who is the Chief Marketing Officer at Natural Habitat Adventures, a nature and wildlife tour operator based in Boulder, Colorado. Ted began his career in the tourism industry as a researcher and instructor at Arizona State University's Tourism Development and Management program, where his work focused on ecotourism development in Central America. Ted moved back to Colorado to become a director of outreach and development for Sustainable Travel International, a nonprofit focused on bringing sustainable solutions to the tourism industry. Ted is currently focused on the intersection of conservation and marketing, pushing NatHab to further its leadership in sustainable travel while overseeing a broad spectrum of traditional digital marketing programs. In his free time, Ted can be found playing music or exploring the slopes and trails of Colorado's backcountry. To Ted's left is Betsy Andrews, an award-winning food, drink, and travel writer focused on sustainability issues. She is contributing editor at Food and Wine Magazine and 750 Daily. And she writes for the Wall Street Journal, Condé Nast Traveler, Travel and Leisure, Plate, Imbibe, Eater, Serious Eats, and many more publications. She's the former executive editor of Savoir magazine and a former New York Times dining critic and creator of Food and Wine's first ever blog. On the line in New Orleans, documenting recovery of New Orleans restaurant industry after Hurricane Katrina. Andrews is also a poet. Some of her books include New Jersey, winner of the Brittingham Prize in Poetry, The Bottom, winner of the 42 Miles Press Prize in Poetry, and most recently, Crowded, which was published in 2022. And on the very far end, we have Daniel Scott, who is a professor and research chair in the Department of Geography, Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. He's also an international research fellow at the School of Hospitality and Tourism at the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. Scott has worked extensively on sustainable tourism for 25 years, with a focus on the transition to a low-carbon tourism economy and adaptation to the complex impacts of a changing climate. He advised and led projects for a wide range of government agencies and tourism organizations around the world, including the United Nations World Tourism Organization, United Nations Environment Program, World Bank, International Olympic Committee, and the OECD. He has also been a contributor to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th assessments, and their 1.5 degrees Celsius special report. In 2021, he was ranked among the world's top 300 climate scientists by Reuters, and he is a Clarivet Scholar ranked as one of the most cited scientists in his field, top 1% globally in 2021 and 2022. His research publications have been featured in many leading media outlets, including The Economist, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, BBC, Time, Scientific American, Sports Illustrated, and National Geographic. In his free time, he can be found in the mountains and traveling the world. Sorry for reading off the script, but I wanted to make sure I got their resumes a little bit well done. And now it's time for each of their opening remarks.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me here. My name's Ted. I'm with a Boulder-based wildlife and nature travel company called Natural Habitat Adventures, founded back in 1985. We specialize in small group conservation-focused journeys on all 7 continents, and we're best known for introducing our guests to the world's most charismatic species and stunning landscapes. We are the partner of World Wildlife Fund, and our core products include African safaris all across Africa, Galapagos Islands adventures, Alaska grizzly bear adventures, and we're best known for our polar bear tours up in Churchill, Manitoba. We believe that travel is a conservation tool. In fact, our mission is conservation through exploration, protecting the planet by inspiring travelers, supporting local communities, and boldly influencing the rest of the travel industry. And climate impacts have been a focus of NatHab for many, many years, kind of long before a lot of other travel companies began to embrace them. Back in 2007, we became the world's first carbon neutral travel company, measuring our carbon footprint across, obviously, our office operations, but across all of our field operations worldwide, minimizing those impacts wherever possible and offsetting those for the last 20 years. Additionally, we're in the process of joining the Science Based Target Initiative. Beyond the carbon side of things, we have introduced a handful of alternative fuel vehicles over the years, including a veggie oil-based transport van here in North America. And just last year, we put our first electric safari vehicle out into the bush in Botswana. Food waste is another climate impact that we've been pretty actively working on. Piloted a whole bunch of different types of initiatives in this realm, most interestingly running the world's first zero waste adventure up in Yellowstone National Park back in 2019. So clearly we're super focused on our own operational impacts as it relates to the climate, but I would like to put forth that the travel industry, and certainly for NatHab, the greatest power we have is leveraging our climate influence. See, that climate influence sort of falls into two different big categories. One of them is in the destination communities where we operate. Most of these places around the world, in the absence of tourism, would be sustaining themselves on more extractive industries, from farming to mining to logging and such. But with the injection of tourism dollars into these local economies, it's creating value and reason for these folks to protect these wild animals, but the wild landscapes that they live on. And with these more intact ecosystems, that has quite the positive impact on a healthy climate. In addition to our destination climate influence, the influence that we can have on our travelers is another key piece where travel can be a force for good. David Attenborough once said, "No one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced." When somebody gets to go see a polar bear ambling across the Arctic tundra, or look into the eyes of a mountain gorilla in the hills of Uganda, that inspires you in ways that are very difficult to explain and to experience in any other way. And we find that people come home from these experiences as conservation ambassadors. In fact, we regularly hear stories from our travelers that say, "Oh man, based on what I learned on your trip, I came home and I bought an electric vehicle," or "We put solar panels on the roof of our family's business," or "We've given substantial amounts of money to conservation NGOs like World Wildlife Fund." And we like to think that it's our role to influence the influencers as a travel company. But there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that is that for all of those positive impacts that I just mentioned to happen, our travelers have to fly halfway around the world. And there's no doubt the climate impacts from air travel and, of course, the transportation that happens on these trips is also a serious contributor to global climate change. We like to think that the net benefit of responsibly managed travel outweighs sort of the negative impacts of it, but let's be honest, most of travel is not like the travel I just described to you. Mass tourism doesn't quite fall into that small scale, responsibly managed travel. The climate impacts of travel threaten the industry. What we're seeing at this point are consumers are becoming more aware, and they're asking themselves important questions. The media is asking us important questions. Should people be traveling the way that they are right now? How can you justify going to see a polar bear in the wild when the very transport that you took up here to experience that bear is directly contributing to its decline? Should people be traveling as frequently as they are, as far as they are? Should people be traveling at all? As a travel industry professional, I have a hard time and struggle with these questions, and I don't know what the right answer is, but certainly today, hopefully we'll have some lively conversations on what travel looks like in a climate-conscious era.
Thank you. Betsy?
All right, well, I can tell a personal story relating to that. So I flew here from New York on an airplane. I've started offsetting, in my own way, offsetting my air travel, which I do a lot. So I gave money to Earth Justice, whose tagline is, because the earth needs a good lawyer. So I prefer to give to activist and advocacy organizations who are working on policies around climate change. And then I went to a gala dinner for this conference. And I had eaten in the airport in Denver, just like a bad burrito in the airport because I was so hungry and I was waiting for the shuttle. So I wasn't really that hungry when the gala started. I left my salad sitting there. I left half the salmon, which I don't know where that salmon came from. I don't know how sustainably it was harvested, it was farmed or caught. I don't know if it was wild salmon. I left most of my meal there. Now, why is this important? I traveled to Stockholm last year, and actually, if you pick up the April issue of Travel and Leisure, my article is in there. It is about what chefs in Stockholm are doing about carbon emissions. So, if you are Swedish, right, and Greta Thunberg is one of your country one of the people in your country, you might have a lot of what they call Flagscham there, which is, flight shame. You might not want to fly. But as it turns out, food waste is a bigger generator of carbon emissions than flying is. Air travel's bad, food waste is worse. Methane gases from food waste is a horrible contributor to greenhouse gases and climate change. So chefs in Stockholm are busy using their food scraps in all sorts of ways. So I did a story about no-waste restaurants in Stockholm. Now, it's particularly important in a place like Stockholm because, most of their farming season is very, very, very short, right? I mean, they've got 6 weeks, a couple of months of farming, and then the rest of the time, they need to preserve all that farm, produce to use in the winter. That is already a no-waste solution. And then people there are using food scraps in all sorts of ways too for high-end dining. Now, what's interesting about this is a transformation in fine dining. Right? I write about restaurants, wineries, travel. That is luxury, right? And luxury is important to people. But we need to think about what luxury means, right? So there's conscious luxury, right? And for consumers, right, that means, supporting restaurants that might not be serving you caviar and foie gras and Wagyu beef and ripe strawberries from halfway around the world, but might be serving you the very best, delicious, preserved, elderberries from the forests of Sweden because you're in Stockholm. One of the restaurants there, which is called Bonnie's at a hotel called the Bank Hotel, which is a Green Key hotel. Now that's a sustainability certification for hotels. The chef told me, we try to, they have one of those giant Sunday brunches, And she said, we try to limit people to 4 little plates of food. We try to not have people just sort of shoveling it in and wasting a bunch of food on their plates. And she said, but they're traveling and it's luxury and they demand the strawberries. And I end that story by saying, we have a job as consumers then. Right? We have a job to educate ourselves and to be able to forego the strawberries in Stockholm, so to speak. Right? And so a lot of this has to do with local food systems and local solutions, and supporting local and regional farming, and supporting supporting restaurants that are supporting local and regional farming. And I'll give you just a couple of other examples. There is a restaurant in Sonoma County called Single Thread. It is a 3-star Michelin restaurant. It has been regularly on the very top of the San Pellegrino list, which is a list of the 100 best restaurants in the world. It's run by a couple named Kyle and Katina Connaughton. And I started doing a story with them in 2019 because they told me about the climate pressures they were facing on their farm, which was on the Russian River at that point. They had a 5-acre farm. They were using regenerative agriculture, really very earth-friendly practices on this farm. But they had some problems, which I'll tell you about. It took me 3 years to get that story finished because, it took me 2 years to get that story finished because of additional climate change issues and COVID. So every single time I was going to file that story, there was yet another disaster in Sonoma. It started in 2017 for them with the Tubbs fire and a flood. Then in 2019, there was a flood on the Russian River from an atmospheric river in the sky that dumped water and 12 feet of flood on their farm and ruined everything. And right after that, there was the Kincaid fire. There was in between a frost. Everything hard froze, and then the smoke from the Kincaid fire sat on their farm and just devastated things. Then in 2020, there was the LNU lightning complex fires, and there was COVID. Well, for them, resilience came in the form of community. Back in 2017, Kyle got other chefs together in Sonoma and started an organization called Sonoma Family Meal. And they started feeding people. And they got their winery partners who have a bunch of money, much of it from, all of it from consumers, to support that initiative. And they fed thousands of people who were displaced from those fires. Since that time, they had expanded to feed people in the hospitality and farming industries, the agriculture and hospitality industries, who are low-income workers who are hungry even though they're producing our food. And through that effort, you can go to Single Thread and spend $400 on your beautiful prefix meal, and some of that meal will be subsidizing the feeding of community there. And because those restaurants were feeding community at a time when their places were closed during COVID, they were able to keep their operations going, and they were able to keep all of their staff. So for me, the important stories out there in this space are the stories where people are innovating and thinking primarily on a local level about, how do we use those dollars that are coming in from international travel to support communities for sustainability on every single level. And I can tell you a million more stories as we go on today.
Thank you, Betsy.
I would just want to add one more thing, which is that in 2020, Barclays, the bank in the UK, did a study across industries and found that the hospitality industry, hospitality and dining, is the industry where the players are the most interested and most concerned over climate change issues and most interested in sustainability. It is a driver, and because they touch consumers so directly, it's a very important place for influence.
Thank you. Now, Daniel, will you keep your opening statement to under 5 minutes so we can get to the discussion, please?
Sorry.
Wait, they put the academic at the end, and they what is that?
I present,
It's the
I
other way
present you a
around.
challenge.
I'm supposed to be the long-winded one up here. Wait a second. Well,
The poet and the academic, right?
right, okay.
Sorry.
So the academic's got to be concise. All right, I'll give it a shot. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this special event. It's really interesting to see how you've tweaked it this year and how you've picked a special theme that is so germane to the next generations that I'm glad you're focusing on climate change this year. As Renner said, I've worked in the climate change and tourism space for about 20 years. Everything for what does sea level rise mean to Caribbean resorts, how to decarbonize national park tourism in a Canadian context, but the same would apply to the US, as has been raised. What is the place of aviation or air travel in a net zero economy in roughly 30 years? These are all big questions, but I'm going to limit my remarks because I have to be concise to something that might be, again, important and both of interest in this neck of the woods. So I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years on what does climate change mean for the ski industry. I've worked with the International Olympic Committee. How do you pick climate resilient hosts? Where can you host the games in the future? So I'll say just a couple words on the climate change and ski industry. First, we're past the point or the era of peak ski seasons. And what I mean by that is the media always asked me, well, what is climate change doing to the ski industry? Hoping to get the answer, oh, the ski seasons are getting shorter and shorter. And that hasn't been the case. And they were always perplexed, but it's getting warmer. And I said, well, across all US regional markets from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, average ski seasons were getting longer. And they looked at me a bit perplexed. And the reason for that is we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in snowmaking. That changed in about 2010. So the last decade, we've seen the tip. We're going back the other way. Average ski seasons are getting shorter across all US regional markets, even with the amount of snowmaking we have in place. So that's no longer able to compensate for the average types of winters that we have. So that's the first point. Of course, the multi-billion-dollar question is what of the future? And what does the ski industry look like going forward? And all the evidence we have, we've done work in North America, Europe, Asia, all point to the same thing, that climate change will change the geography of where we can ski by 2050. It doesn't matter which climate change scenario you use, low emission, Paris compatible, all the way through the higher moderate emission scenarios, it will change. And in every regional market, there are winners and losers. So there are opportunities and risk. Some of those destinations, some of the ski areas, will be able to benefit from essentially some of their competitors falling out of the marketplace. You'll be able to gain market share even if your season length is average a little bit smaller. So every ski tourism destination is going to have to adapt to climate change, but for very different reasons. If you're on the loser end of the scale, job losses and the things that come with that. If you're on one of those in the winners sort of circle, you've got to adapt, you've got to maintain a skier experience, you've got to have up your capacity to handle that transfer of demand from other places, which is more than just better snowmaking. It's your services, your parking, your transportation, all of which you have to try to decarbonize at the same time. Sustainability, or snowmaking, is a key part of pretty much every ski area's strategy going forward. How do you adapt to climate change, whether it's here in Canada, Europe? And the sustainability of snowmaking, you've probably seen in your media as well, is increasingly being questioned. And what I want to say is we really want to oppose the narrative that all snowmaking is unsustainable. That's not the case. It really runs the gamut from what can be quite sustainable, and I give you an example. Quebec, the province next to us, but even our province, we're entirely nuclear, hydro, and wind and solar. Quebec is entirely hydro, solar, wind. So you can make double, triple, quadruple the amount of snowmaking. There is no carbon footprint associated with it. There's no carbon footprint associated with their lifts. And if you drive there in an electric vehicle, against at least the transportation phase, the emissions are essentially zero. So you can have a net zero tourism product today. You don't have to wait 50 years from now for that to change. So that's one end of the spectrum. But then there are other cases where in California and some other places, they're using groundwater for snowmaking. Well, that is certainly not sustainable. So you have to recognize how place specific it is, and the communities in which that snowmaking is happening have to, agree to what is the place of that snowmaking, what is the place of ski tourism in their climate plans and their long-term development plans. The last point, and I'll be concise, I'm getting the look, is just to very quickly echo some of the points that were made in the greenwash session, if anybody saw that this morning. Mandatory climate and carbon risk disclosure is coming to all publicly traded businesses within the next 1 to 3 years. The SEC in your country has guidance out for comment, so that will probably be implemented in some flavor. Probably this fall. Canada has the same, Europe has the same, New Zealand, Australia. That's coming. And so the answer is we got this isn't going to wash, if you will. You're going to have to show not only what are you doing on your carbon side of things, but what your climate, that you understand what your climate risk is and how you're going to adapt to that. So those are the two pieces that the ski industry is going to have to answer those questions probably within the next 5 years. Did I make it?
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much for all the opening statements and the introductions. I'd like to kick things off to talk a little bit about the positive impacts that the tourism and travel industry has with regards to the experiences and looking the gorilla in the eyes to help care about things more, the need for luxury food to deal with the excesses that society produces, and ski resorts, which is where I spend all of my time and where my passion is. And so the positive impacts, but also, is it net positive with regards to the negative externalities that they create? So that's my first question.
Daniel, why don't you start?
I get to go first now. Well, I'll take a big picture on that. I mean, that's usually the level that I work at, is at the international scale. And just to give you some sense, globally, tourism is roughly 10% of GDP, again, if you trust industry numbers, but even if they're slightly off, it's in that magnitude. And about 10% of employment. Most people don't realize how big that is, and that's globally. So then if you go down into countries like some of the small island developing states, it can be as high as 75%. So if you crush tourism, you've got real problems. And we saw that under COVID when there was lockdowns in some island states. Their debt went through the ceiling because the tourism dollars weren't coming in for healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. Their credit ratings tanked, so they were paying more on their debt. So again, that debt spiral in some of these countries. And there are a lot of countries that are banking on, and Ted sort of mentioned this at a destination scale, but countries too, that tourism is a big part of their economic development strategy over the next sort of 30 years. And many of those countries actually align where climate change risk is actually the highest as well. So that's an important message. However, I'm a geographer. The world is the place I want to see. I also study tourism. I want my two daughters, I want the next generations to be able to go and see part of the world, not just because of the economics, but those of you that travel know it's really hard to hate somebody halfway around the world that you had dinner with, right? So even from a geopolitical level, that type of exposure and connection amongst people is so vital. So we absolutely want tourism to continue. What we have to figure out is how to make it compatible with that net zero economy sort of roughly in 30 years, which is a big hill to climb. That gorilla is 5 to 8% of global CO2 emissions, so it's not trivial, but that's where we want to get to.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of stories. So that pertain to the fact that tourism industry also can be a front line against the introduction of dirty industry in certain places where there's enough tourism industry that they're fighting against that. So I did a story in the Boundary Waters for Travel and Leisure again. This is the very spongy part of northern Minnesota between our country and Daniel's country. And I was portaging and paddling, right? So paddling in a canoe and then carrying the canoe to the next lake, these beautiful black lakes, with gorgeous islands to camp on, just exquisite. Well, that whole area has been threatened by a giant international copper mining conglomerate that wanted to put a copper mine in the Boundary Waters. And under the Trump administration, where Sonny Perdue was the head of the Department of Agriculture, and he had oversight of that, that was going to happen. But there was a lot of pushback by environmentalists, but also really by the tourism industry there in the Boundary Waters, which supports millions of dollars of businesses in that very pristine area. And that project, the copper mine, has not gone forward under the Biden administration. Biden's protected that area, but it would have. There really might have been accelerated under the Trump administration if there hadn't been so much pushback from the tourism industry. And this is the power of journalism, because the reason that I went and told that story, was so that I could tell people about the threat of the copper mine, people who might not have known, and people who just read a luxury travel magazine. And the other story I want to tell is about Bonaire. So Bonaire is a Dutch island, protectorate in the Leeward Islands, east of the Caribbean. And it is surrounded by a nationally protected reef. Bonaire's history was in the slave trade. The Spanish were there first. The Spanish cut down every tree that was there. It was already kind of a desert island, but then the Spanish destroyed anything that would have kept that island from desertification. And then after that, the Dutch came and exploited the salt there with using enslaved Africans to do that work. So there was environmental decimation hundreds of years ago there. But the Bonaire of today is a place that survives on scuba diving vacations. And so it needs a healthy reef. So the policies of Bonaire have become very, very water and earth friendly because of that, because of the need for tourism. So if you are a scuba diver like I am, and I went there and did a story on bird watching just recently, which actually is in this month's Condé Nast Traveler. You can do a reef restoration dive where you are helping, on a reef nursery to regenerate the reef there. So there are ways you can be part of that, but you're part of that just because of your desire to go to this place and partake of, consume of that natural beauty. Without it, that island would be nowhere economically, as Daniel's saying. So therefore, this is like a hundreds of years story of actually cleaning up the environment there, and they're continuing to do it with reforestation. So things don't always, things really can get better if there's decent policy.
Betsy, you bring up a really important point. There's this dynamic between the need to preserve these environments and the massive environmental impact that getting to there goes, and what the money that drives those economies. And I'd like Ted to speak a little bit more on kind of the relationship between preserving the environments and how to mediate the impacts of getting there and exploring those parts of the world.
Sure thing. So the travel industry, the impact of it, both positive and negative, is not uniform. In fact, it's very heavily weighted to the style of travel that people engage in. Mass tourism in destinations is detrimental to local societies, local economies, exploiting these areas, and of course, exploiting these landscapes. However, more carefully planned tourism, and it doesn't necessarily need to be small wildlife tourism like we do, but carefully planned tourism that integrates the local economy and the local businesses and such that play host to travelers is how we can maximize the positive impacts of the industry. And so in order for us to achieve a more truly sustainable travel industry into the future, we have to shift the way people think about travel and think and purchase it in their purchasing decisions and how and who they choose to travel with. In fact, as a traveler, your biggest impact is determined by who you choose to spend your travel dollars with. And so when we think about some of these impacts that are happening, like putting the travel to and from aside, these destination communities that play host to us are the environments that they're protecting are key to the product, as we've discussed here. And without those tourism dollars connecting with the people that actually are connected to that land, connected to those small businesses, then we're not able to create a sustainable economy in these destinations, and that is what leads us to some of the more negative situations that we find ourselves in.
To build off of that, what role do governments, consumers, and businesses have in driving that change?
I've got a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah.
They need to work together. I mean, like we work very, very hard on the business side of things, local level business to our outbound business. But without the support of local regulations, the conservation initiatives are not going to have the opportunity to thrive. I mean, in the African bush, we can send as many travelers as we can to support the local folks that run the lodges and that take our travelers out to introduce them to these crazy, amazing species. But without the government actually recognizing the importance of that economic infusion and setting rules and protection around the protected areas, then what we end up seeing is more and more farming creeping into places like the Masai Mara. So it's absolutely a big an important collaborative effort to bring industry and government together in order to create long-standing protection.
Betsy, do you have some thoughts on the production processes?
Yeah, so, and I'll just sort of talk about where consumers are concerned. So, you might just go out and buy some beer and drink some beer. But you also can go out and buy some beer and drink some beer from a company that works with 1% for the planet. Right, 1% for the planet has those companies giving 1% of their revenue to environmental organizations, many of which are involved in climate change. And that's easy to find out because you can go to 1%fortheplanet.com, or you can go to the website of whatever beer that you like, and you can see what they're doing if they're supporting these organizations. So as a consumer, it's quite easy because these products, they want to advertise the fact that they're involved in this kind of stuff. So that's really important. But you have to kind of dig a little bit deeper. And this is where policy comes in. For instance, we were talking about compostable plastics, and I think this came up on the greenwashing panel too. This is something that I'm very interested in because I write about food and drink, right? And that stuff comes in packaging. And that packaging is more or less sustainable. Sometimes some of it's very not sustainable. Sometimes it very much is sustainable. But as consumers, we need to be pushing for policies that make that stuff more sustainable. Because, for instance, if you get something and it's, it's compostable plastic. You ordered from your favorite restaurant. It's plastic shell. It's compostable. The silverware is compostable. The drink bottles, compostable plastic. Well, actually, it's only compostable if you have a high heat facility. Not many municipalities have them, and so most of that stuff just goes into the waste stream. So it's a real case of greenwashing, and there's a lot of that out there. So I think the number one thing is, as consumers, you have to be educated. You have to care. I get about a zillion newsletters every morning on my phone from many different environmental organizations, and I skim them. Takes me half an hour of lying in bed, and I get educated pretty rapidly. So it's not so hard to do that. But you have to be educated, because then you have to ask your government to be accountable. In the United States, we have a less than 30% recycling rate in the United States. In Europe, it's over 80%. And it's really on us to make that happen.
Can I just comment on a couple of things? So,
Yeah.
Ted mentioned partnerships, and that's absolutely key. One of the things I say in many of the islands and other areas that I work in, tourism can't thrive when the community fails. So after, whether it's a hurricane or whatever drove that, if the community can't, tourism often recovers far faster after a natural disaster than the rest of the communities that surround it, because the infrastructure is built better. They have the economics to bring in the construction, et cetera. So that's absolutely important, from the business level to the destinations, all the way up to the national policy. And I just want to touch on that a little bit. Most countries, their tourism policy and sustainability are absolutely disconnected, let alone the climate change side. Most tourism, whether it's a ministry or department, their job over the last 20 years has been to count the tourists, the economic value of them, and how the hell do we get more? That's about it. That's their metrics of success. How do you get more tourists in here? That may or may not be what the community wants. An example like Barcelona, they don't control the airport, somebody else controls the airport. They wanted to limit the number of slots, they couldn't do it. So even when the community asks for it, it doesn't get done because the policy is at a national level. There are leaders, New Zealand, for example, is asking serious questions. Do we want cruise tourism, period? Right? So they're looking at how do we make our aviation compatible with a net zero economy? Is cruise part of that? They're asking that question. They don't have an answer yet, but they're asking some of those tough questions. So,
Daniel, real quick, a question from the audience regarding cruise ships.
Sure.
Do you have some statistics or information about the environmental impacts of those huge cruise ships?
The environmental record of most of the cruise industry has been horrible up until about 5 years ago. It's getting better. I'll give them that. Better is a qualitative term. But purely from an emissions perspective, it's one of the worst things you can do from a tourism product, I'm sorry to say. Typically you fly to a Miami or whatever, and then you get on a floating city for a week or 2 weeks. That is powered primarily, well, if not exclusively, through diesel generation. So even when it pulls into port in many Caribbean countries, they can't power that up because they don't have enough juice. That's changed. Some of the boats don't even have that bidirectional connection either. So they'll pull in, they have to, so you've seen that pictures in Alaska, now that you get an air inversion, the air quality goes horribly wrong. So that is unfortunately one of the worst tourism products you can engage in. Again, it's getting slightly better, but you two can weigh in on that too.
A couple of thoughts on it. I agree with your statements of how fundamentally bad it is, but when you think about the volume of people that are choosing cruise companies, even a 1% improvement in their sustainability engagement has a very large impact compared to many of the small businesses. So that's not me giving the cruise industry a ton of credit, but small steps forward can have notable impacts in terms of quantification of improvements. The other big challenge with the cruise industry are the shore excursions that happen as a result of them, and it's kind of a poster child for the sort of unsustainable approach to tourism, because people come off of these ships, they don't tend to go more than 500 feet, if we're lucky, half a mile from it. All of the businesses that tend to surround those ports are half the time owned by the cruise company or some subsidiary or connection of them. And so we see this problem of leakage where 80–90% of the dollars spent in these destination communities don't actually stay with the locals, but then flow up to these multinational corporations. And that's not the kind of tourism that creates sustainable local livelihoods in ways that want to support the destination and the tourists themselves.
I'd also just add the impact of those giant ships on coral reefs has been very, very problematic.
Another question from the audience talking about food waste and composting. What is the net benefit of composting, and what role does it play in modern society?
Well, it depends what kind of composting you're talking about, but for food waste, I mean, it's terrific. And so I think I think that we need to talk about, and we were discussing this earlier, Daniel, talk about a systemic approach, right? So you can compost yourself in your backyard, and grow your vegetables, but you also can be part of a community that has a larger composting effort. In New York City, the green markets in New York City are part of actually a regional farming system. They support farms in New York State with the farmers markets, with food boxes, and they also support the SNAP program for low-income New Yorkers who can use their benefits at the farmers market and with these low-income food boxes. And that's really important because New York State itself is losing a farm every 3 days, mainly to consolidation by industrial farms. So they're losing family farms and smaller regional farms. The Green Market also runs the composting program. And so people bring their food scraps when they're going to the farmers market. They keep them frozen or wherever they keep them, and then they can get compost back from the Green Market. This is in lieu of New York City itself doing the job it should be doing, which is curbside composting. So I think composting is really an important discussion, and I think that it actually really has to, again, happen at the governmental policy level ultimately.
Yeah, if I can just add to that quickly. In our community, we have blue boxes, which are our recycle ones, and then we have a green bin, which is all of your composting, whether it's my wife's Easter flowers or what you had for dinner a couple of weeks ago, and then all our yard waste goes into that. That goes to a large facility that then turns into compost, which is given back to farmers. And there's a reason why societies have composted historically. It works as a fertilizer. The other big thing that we've seen in our landfill already is emission levels come down. The methane's not there. Like what would break down either aerobically or anaerobically is not in the waste stream nearly to the same extent. So again, you see those sort of benefits at the landfill in emission scale as well.
Awesome. Ted, I've got an interesting question for you. What influence do you think the metaverse will have on travel, and do you see that as a threat to your business at all?
Wow, interesting question. We've for a long time have talked about whether we should get into the business of doing some VR filming in some of these destinations. Imagine if we took a big old VR camera out to see the polar bears up in Churchill or out on a safari in Africa, and we could bring that experience to people in places where they have headsets. And we've even thought about sending those headsets to people in the mail that Facebook was making for a while. I think that there's actually a pretty important role in tourism marketing for virtual reality and eventually getting into metaverse-related conversations, in that there are some people that do not have the ability to travel to go see these things and would love to feel some version of that inspiration and such. on one extreme, one may say, well, we shouldn't be traveling at all, and at least the way that we can maybe experience them in the most lifelike way is to take these more complex apparatus out there and create a metaverse where you can see wildlife face to face. And I'm not certain that won't ever happen, but I will say that humans have an innate desire to explore. And while we can, wet our whistle a little bit with some of the virtual reality experiences, there's not a whole lot that substitutes, smelling the breath of a tiger as it walks by you, right? And so I'm not too worried that our business is going to go down because of that. But on the climate side, I'm a little more worried there.
Awesome.
What does tiger breath smell like, Ted?
I got to tell you, I haven't seen any tigers, but I have smelled the breath of a lion as it's walked by, and it smells probably like mine does in the morning.
Right. And then another question from the audience. This one's from a student. Do ski lifts pollute, and what is the main issue with ski resorts and climate change currently?
The answer to that is it depends. As I said, it's very place specific. So again, if you come back to my province where the grid is essentially clean, you're electrify your lifts, your snowmaking, other pieces have no carbon associated with it. So yes, you pay for the energy. Most of the water in the major resorts where I work there, we've built purpose-built reservoirs at the bottom, so you capture spring freshet, and they can help with flood control. Put that on the hill in winter, and about 80 to 90% of that comes back down into the same watershed the next spring. So sustainability from water and energy and emissions perspective can be quite good. As I said, if you're mining groundwater in a California context to make snow not so sustainable, part of that is dependent on your grid. So the bad news in your state is your grid is carbon intensive. So when you make snow, the carbon intensity of that snowmaking is 10, 20, 100-fold what it is in some other jurisdictions in the world. So until, when we talked about systematic change, until that grid is fixed, some of your ski areas, they're trying to compete with one hand tied behind their back. They can buy offsets, et cetera, but that's part of it. And that has additional costs. So that's why a place like Aspen has been advocating. So they've done their house in order stuff as best as they can, but again, they have the grid they have to deal with. They've advocated for 20 years-ish, probably 15, 20 years, both to state level and federal level, to fix the system, because that's what they draw. And when that's fixed, all of the players now have a much more sustainable product, not just the leaders in the field. So that's what we want to do in the tourism sector to the extent possible, is fix the system, because then even the laggards are much better, right? Not just the showcase ones that have been leaders for 20 years. So bottom line, it depends. One of the big questions we've talked about flying is, can you use a strategy where you're bringing in, whether it's private jets that are not electrified yet, flying people in Whistler, we have the same problem in Canada, trying to attract the Chinese market or the Austrians to come over and ski. Well, that ski holiday has a carbon footprint that's off the charts relative to somebody from Vancouver driving up to the day in their electric vehicle. So it's market segment, business model, and where you're placed. You can have opposite ends of the spectrum.
Awesome. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Sustainable aviation fuel, that's what we need.
All right. I've got a question for Betsy and Ted as kind of ideas with extensive experience in travel industries and food and drink. What are some recommendations you have to businesses trying to become more sustainable and try to kind of target that market? And how can they get there? What should they do?
The most important thing to do is to measure your impacts as a business. Like, you can't really you can't manage what you don't measure, as they say. And so until you know what your carbon footprint is, what your waste stream footprint is, what your energy use is, it's pretty hard to do more than just sort of nominal efforts and such. So the measurement is a big piece of it. Understanding what you can control and what is addressable is the next big step. In the example of a tour operator, it's a very fragmented industry. We actually own very little infrastructure. We work with partners, and part of the business model the sustainable tourism model is that we hire local people to be able, in their businesses, to deliver services for us, right? But that limits our ability to have an impact on those things. We can push our supply chain to suggest that they engage in certain sustainable practices. And the way that we are most successful with that is by providing inspiration and tools to be able to do it. So we'll pilot, for instance, this year we are we recently opened this incredible place called Alaska Bear Camp, nestled in the middle of Lake Clark National Park, just across the Cook Inlet from Homer. You land on a beach in order to get there. It's totally inaccessible, and we are working this year to make that property zero waste. And we've done some zero waste efforts across a lot of our trips. But this is the time that we're taking a whole season. 400 people are visiting there this summer, and we're going to make that camp zero waste. And once we learn how to do that and how we stumble with that, because in order for us to get trash out of there, we have to pile it up, we have to put it in a boat, we have to bring it around, we have to put it in these little bush planes. And by the way, there's a bunch of bears that are really hungry for food scraps, right? So it's a unique challenge, but a challenge that is not so unique when you think of an African safari context, where you've got these camps out in the middle of the African bush, trying, a lot of them are great with the solar, but the food waste side of things is a big challenge. So we hope to be able to use our learnings and help to influence our supply chain. So working with partners is another way as a business to, band together and share best practices, and that's some examples at least.
And one thing that can really help that in the food space, the drink space in particular, is certifications. So, and there's this also in the food space, actually, in farming. So in wine, which is a luxury item, there are many different certifications for sustainability. There's a new organization, a relatively new organization, called the International Wineries for Climate Action. And the great thing about the certification for an organization like that is that if you join your winery, every year you have to do better. Like the measurements it's third-party audited, the measurements are pretty intense, and then you have to figure out every year how you are going to decrease your carbon emissions even more. And that's not just through scope 1 and 2, which would be the things on your own, in your own operations, but scope 3, which is your suppliers, your shipping, your glass, all of that stuff. And this is going to become, as Ted has said, is going to become really, really important, more and more important. So certification in that sense is really a tool for you doing your best work in terms of decreasing your carbon emissions. And then the other thing I would reiterate is working with community. I did a story in a place in southern Belize called Kapali. So this is a lodge, very high-end sort of jungle lodge that has a organic rum distillery on the property with big organic cane fields and a really beautiful organic farm and an organic chocolate works. And all of that, they are the largest employer in southern Belize at this point. This project was started with the help and consultation of local environmental activists there who were trying to stop destructive fishing and destruction of the forest there by people who lived there, because logging was really only one of the things that they had to earn money. As Ted was saying, it was an extractive industry. So the tourism industry there now with Kapali supports the community by employing people, and it also, the wages are 3 times what the average is in Belize. But they also then give money back to the community for community projects there, for cultural and environmental projects in the community. So it was conceived to be a community project. It was a financier. The guy had a lot, who knows how he made his money. But this project in itself is a project that is fully sustainable because of its community involvement.
And I've got a question. One of the really important topics that Ted and Betsy brought up was certifications and reporting your emissions. What role do governments play in that, and what are some organizations that are doing a good job like promoting the certifications and making it a standard format?
Well, cross-sector, like if you go science-based, as the greenwash session before us identified, that's sort of a gold standard for me as an academic. Greenhouse gas protocols is another one that has set standards for a long time. The problem with some of those is, so greenhouse gas protocols has protocols for cities or destinations, so you could use those. They talk about scope 3, so upstream, outside of your community, but they give no guidance in terms of how do you handle tourism. They have scope 3 for business, but they have no examples or no guidance on tourism. So the boundaries, I think, as Ted said, from a system level, what you count, what's the responsibility of somebody else in the tourism sector is still blurry. And so that's one thing that we are trying to push the UN World Tourism Organization and the World Travel and Tourism Commission, which is an industry arm, to come up with standards like that so that all the destinations are talking about the same things. We include this, we don't include this. That's somebody else's responsibility. And once we get there, you're comparing apples to apples, and that's where we want to get to. So that's one of the things we're trying to do over the next sort of year or so, is trying to come up with guidance that can be put out to comment throughout the tourism sector so that people can come to terms with that, because there was the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Change and Tourism 2 years ago that basically repeated what the work we did for the UNWTO 15 years ago. They said they wanted to be climate neutral. That was the goal. Nothing happened for 15 years. And then suddenly it was net zero was this new commitment. Well, we said, but you said that 15 years ago, and you're not able to even measure it. So how are you going to say you're making progress at a sector level or not? So these are some of the challenges, and that's not unique to tourism. So that's not to point the finger just at tourism. Other sectors struggle with that, but some others are further ahead, and we want to catch up over the next 5 or less years, hopefully.
Yeah, and just relative to what Ted was saying, in the wine industry, there are so many certifications. This is sort of the drawback. There's so many that it's so fragmented, and it becomes kind of impossible to sort of see it in a larger context and really know from region to region and from certification to certification, who's doing really a good job. So the Sustainable Wineries Roundtable, which is based in London, is doing the work of looking at every single certification in wine right now to come up with a sort of a global parameters for, okay, here's what all of these certifications include, here's what they should include, here's how they need to deviate, because really there are regional differences in terms of how you need to grow your grapes and run your winery. And how can we come up with something sort of more standardized so that particularly with scope, with all these, with financing being attached to your emissions, in the near future, those can be used as measures, like true measures, in a larger sense.
Certification for travel and tourism holds a place near and dear to my heart because back in 2005, I worked for a nonprofit that developed an eco-certification standard for the travel industry. We thought, this is gonna be awesome. We're gonna develop this tool that's gonna help businesses do that measurement I mentioned, improve the sustainability of their operations, be able to claim that they have made measurable results, and they're gonna be able to show that to their travelers, and it's gonna help them earn industry recognition and hopefully business as well. And we were so psyched, and it turns out that it's really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for a lot of reasons. One, in some ways, it kind of needs to be demand driven. In other words, if there's no demand, consumer demand, traveler demand, that is looking for the good housekeeping stamp of approval, then it's very difficult for most businesses to justify the very notable amount of human resource and dollar investment it takes to actually reach these standards. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. But how can we create demand if there's not a single certification standard that everybody recognizes? And it turns out, similar to wine, that there are hundreds of tourism certification standards around the world. Costa Rica has probably the best one. It's called CST, and it is a government-funded standard that they pay for a good chunk of the costs of becoming certified, and it's on, obviously on the business to make the improvements to their business. But as a result, you can go to Costa Rica and look for those CST leaves and know that you're going to get a truly sustainable product. And at this point, sorry, truly sustainable is too strong of a word, but you're going to work with a company that is working towards those sustainability goals. But the United States does not have one that is well known. There are 27 of them across Europe. And so at this point, there used to be an organization called the Global Sustainable Tourism Council that was working to kind of be an umbrella organization to say, hey, if your certification locally meets these levels, then you get to have the GSTC stamp of approval. And that was a UN funded entity for a while, and it was going really, really well, but then it lost funding and steam, and now people continue to be confused. Businesses don't know what to pursue, and it's expensive, and most of us are spending our time and resources doing what we think is right rather than trying to reach a certain stamp of approval.
Awesome. So we're nearing the end, but I'd like to spend the rest of the time focusing on a couple of questions. There's two that kind of go hand in hand. The first one is from a student that says, how can the U.S. increase recycling statewide? And then the other one is talking about food and business shifting to reusable products and getting rid of all to-go and reusable options for like to-go food options. So if we could talk about those kind of hand in hand, that'd be great. Betsy, do you want to start with the food industry and to-go products?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think it would be a wonderful idea if your takeout restaurant was asking you to bring your own container. That is also something that could be legislated. I'll just say that. The same thing with recycling. I mean, we really need to ask our elected officials to legislate these things. An interesting thing that's sort of coming from not coming from government is the idea of returnables in the wine sector, returnable bottles. You need a lot of infrastructure for that stuff, right? Because stuff needs to be washed. It needs to be brought to, it needs to be gathered, it needs to be washed, it needs to be refilled. The infrastructure takes time. So there are two things that drive that, right? There's policy and there's somebody thinking they can make some money off of it. When somebody comes up with the idea to make some money off of it, if that person has some money and they can actually then go to their elected officials and lobby for help with the infrastructure, then those things happen, right? So, I think we also need to sort of look at the entities in the food space, in the drink space, in the travel space that have the money to drive the change, and also push those companies to do their best in this stuff.
I'll just give you an anecdote from my country community. So we've had our Blue Box, our recycling program, since the late 1980s. Right, that's how long it's been there, and then materials get added over time, and in the same way you had a virgin materials industry grow up over decades and decades, you had to have an industry figure out how do we use these secondary materials. Aluminum's a no-brainer, but plastics and other things took time. What materials can you do and utilize? So that sector has been maturing, but again, our quality of life isn't that much different than yours, having that. And then this year we banned single-use plastics, not at a community level, at a province. And then so takeout, you have to have paper compostable type things, but there's ways around it. You just have to be creative, right? So you can look at jurisdictions elsewhere, and the technical solutions are there. It's just a matter of will, whether it's at a state legislature or a community level, put these programs in place. And some of the recycling ones, if you have a high percentage of aluminum, can largely pay for much of the other things that are recycling losses in some cases, but the economics can even work itself out in some cases as well.
Awesome, and I think we have time for one more question. This one's from a student. The question is, will climate change affect the popularity of winter games in the future? And if so, how come? And I'd like to take this to a little bit of a broader scope as well. Once we get a system to report the climate impacts of certain tourism industries or foods, do you think the popularity of those is going to go down, or will demand stay the same?
If I can hop in, I am really curious to see whether or not people's climate consciousness, this climate shaming, this climate guilt that we are all starting to feel more and more, will affect real decisions that we make. What we're seeing so far is that in places that are a little bit more climate conscious forward, like Europe, we are seeing decision-making change. So people are traveling more locally. I've got tour operator friends that work in the Netherlands and Germany who have adjusted down their international trips and are pushing people to more regional trips that are train-based and more sustainable in their operation. And we truly are seeing consumers make a shift based on what their knowledge is. Another thing we're seeing quite a bit in Europe, and we're actually in the process of mirroring it now, is climate transparency. What is the footprint of each one of these trips? And so now on our Africa programs, for instance, you can see the individual carbon footprint from each trip, and you can decide, hey, is this something that am I interested in taking the trip that has a footprint that's perhaps 40% more climate intensive than another one, and will we see people make those changes? I came back from a recent conference just really jazzed. Like, the mentality of consumers is shifting. We have to be transparent. We have to be good at quantifying the benefits so people don't stop traveling. And my boss said, yeah, Europeans will do that, but Americans, not sure that we're going to get to that. So he's perhaps a little bit less optimistic on it, but I do think that he makes a point that I'm not certain that our desire for convenience and for to be able to do what our will is going to be truly curbed by a knowledge of that impact on a purchase by purchase basis.
I'm going to let Ted talk about winter sports, but I did want to say that, Daniel, the trips that you're talking about are probably pretty expensive.
Oh, yeah.
And so and they're probably a little bit of an older traveler.
Indeed.
Who has the income. But younger people, Renner, your generation, thank goodness for your generation, younger millennials and Gen Zs, every indicator is, every study of your generation as consumers, is like, you care. You really care. So if we're talking about things that are a smaller financial lift, like the food and drink that you buy, you're asking the questions. You care where the food came from. You care how it was produced. You care how that the drinks, the weight of the bottle of your drinks. So I do think these things are going to change because your generation at some point will be older and will have the disposable income to go on one of Daniel's trips, and you'll be asking those same questions. So I am hopeful for the future.
I'll just quickly answer the first part of that question, which was the Olympic side. So we've done work for the IOC, I think three times. They are concerned about the future of the game. Some of the work that we did before, we went from 21 climate reliable host nations or cities down to about half of that in 2050, and it continued to decline depending on the emission scenario after that. So that sparked some of their concerns. They, as you may have seen, delayed a decision who to assign the next host to. Salt Lake was one of the candidates, Vancouver, and Sapporo was the other one, based on some of the work we did, because they wanted us to do a bit more exploration in terms of how can you make the games more climate reliable. And part of that, to their credit, they're being very creative. Rather than one city, one country hosting, which is typically the model, they're open to a regional game. So it could be Denver and Calgary work together, and you get the best of the snow sports reliability. You get a new hockey rink, we get something. Two countries, a state and a province, and two cities split the bill. The disruption locally isn't nearly as much, or Salt Lake, whatever the case is. So they're open to that kind of thing. But the Olympic athletes that we've surveyed and talked to are absolutely concerned about the future of their sport. And part of that is what happens to those local ski areas that most of them started on? And if those disappear, the pipeline, not just to your recreational skiers that become your tourists, but the pipeline to the elite athletes that become your Winter Olympians is also crushed, and they take up whether it's hockey or something else, indoors, gymnastics, whatever your thing is. So there's absolute concerns about the future of sport amongst your generation, but those who are pro and Winter Olympic athletes right now too.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think that's all of our time. Quick round of applause for our panelists.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.